Welcome to the Political Data Yearbook podcast. My name is Raul Gomez. I'm one of the editors of the Political Data Yearbook. And today we're going to talk about Slovakia, which had a parliamentary election on Saturday, the 30th of September. And so to discuss issues surrounding the parliamentary election and Slovakian politics more generally, I've got here with me three wonderful guests, starting in alphabetical order with Kevin Deegan-Krause, who is a professor of political science at Wayne State University. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
Second guest is Erika Harris, professor and holder of the Bowes Chair in Politics at the University of Liverpool. Hello, Erika.
Hello.
And last but not least, our third guest is Erik Láštic, associate professor at Comenius University and Slovakian contributor to the Political Data Yearbook. Hi, Erik.
Hi, everyone.
And so it's a pleasure having you all with me. I hope the election didn't keep you awake last weekend.
It certainly did.
It didn't, but only because I'm 6 time zones away. So it would have. My colleague went to bed at 5 a.m. when we were still working. So
it's been very busy.
I can imagine. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about first is I wanted to begin by discussing the election results for our listeners, just to give a little bit of context. So suppose most of our listeners would have heard about the victory of the Smer party, whose leader is the populist and somehow controversial Fico, whom Erika just mentioned. So can you tell us more about what happened in the election? What was interesting about it? What was surprising about it, etc.?
Well, what happened? The 3 times Prime Minister, Fico, despite that he was or had to resign in 2018 under popular protests against corruption and has criminal charges against him, is a winning party. It is not so much of a surprise. There are other surprises. It's actually, given the circumstances, I think the result isn't that disastrous, and that actually the rise of progressive Slovakia and weakened Fico, who is actually not finding that easy to form the coalition, is a good news. So whilst it's a disappointing result, it's not a disastrous result, and we don't actually have at the moment a real result how and who is going to form the government.
If I could just lay a little context, I think I really want to hear what Erik has to say, but just for those who don't know Slovakia's politics necessarily, Slovakia has a fairly unusual electoral system in that all 150 members of the Slovak National Council are elected on an extremely proportional representation system in a single district. So they use the Hagenbach-Bischoff system, which is really quite proportional, and everyone is elected in the same district. What that means is that in those elections that Erika mentioned, there were 8 parties that got significant numbers of votes. So the winning margin, the winning party, really took 23%, to just under 23% of the vote, with the next parties coming in at 18, at 15, at 10, and then 6, 5, 5. And so that really, of the 7 parties that ultimately did get elected, actually, the numbers are quite small for any given party, and it's a quite widely dispersed political party system. The other thing that I think is important is that there's no single dimension of competition in Slovakia, so that while there is a kind of left-right in economic terms, that only overlaps partially with a kind of anti-West or West Russian dimension in foreign policy, which overlaps to some degree on culture war issues. And then there is a significant anti-corruption dimension. And so, each of these parties, these 7 parties that get elected, and then some of the other parties that come close, each of those stands in a quite distinct position, which can make coalition formation quite difficult. I hope that's not too much information on the background.
No, not at all. I think that's very informative. So then we've got 7 parties elected, and many of them got around 20% or a little bit less of the vote share. Is that the case? So that means that it's going to be very difficult to form a government. There will have to be, for sure, a coalition government, right?
I mean, the Slovak system produces coalition governments, with one exception in 2012, when Smer was able, due to a lot of votes that were wasted because parties didn't get into parliament, create a single party government. But usually it's at least three parties, sometimes four parties, that are needed to enter the coalition and form some majority. So from this perspective, there are two clear sort of alternatives how things could play out in the next few days. But maybe I will continue with what Kevin started to say that, I mean, for me, the Slovak elections are proof that the representative democracy works in Slovakia. From the perspective, if you looked at 2022, 2023 questions in surveys about how satisfied are you with the country's direction, how satisfied are you with the government's performance, 70+% of population said that they are not satisfied or completely dissatisfied. So from this perspective, voters basically voted on the government's or the former coalition's record. They said they did a pretty poor job, and they basically selected alternatives from opposition. And first three parties that Kevin already mentioned, either Smer or Progresívne Slovensko or Hlas, are all opposition parties. So this election is really about the basically system working how it should work, and basically accountability and alternatives that are viable, and voters decided, okay, it's time to select somebody else, either somebody else who already was 3 times prime minister and won 4 elections, or somebody completely else, as Progressive Slovakia represents.
So do you think that's what explains Fico's comeback? Because so he was the country's prime minister. You've been mentioning that before, I think between 2006 and 2010, right? And then between 2012 and 2018. But in 2018, he was forced out of office, right? After all of those mass protests prompted by the murder of a journalist that was investigating corruption in his government, right? So after all of those protests and all that anger against him in 2018, how do you explain his return, his recent victory?
I mean, to me, one explanation has to do with the performance of the former coalition led by this protest movement and leader Igor Matović. They won over around 25% in the 2020 parliamentary elections, and they were able to form unique majority in Slovakia from the perspective they had a constitutional majority. So 4 parties basically had all things at their disposal to change the country as such, and yet they were chaotic. They were not able to convince public that what they are doing are basically good things and good governing, despite the fact that, especially in last year, they massively increased the welfare transfers to population. And yet their record was such that basically they were completely defeated. I think those 4 parties that created the constitutional majority in 2020 lost around 700,000 votes from 3 million that are usually casted. That's a huge loss. So for me, it's one explanation.
There is also another. I mean, it's one thing is the chaos of the previous coalition and generally a rather difficult and tumultuous time. Another one is that Fico, despite the controversy, has a very steady electoral base. It's shrinking every time, it's smaller, but he does have very faithful base. And this victory is also on the back of, better the devil you know, because the last few years in Slovak politics were, well, hardly, it seemed almost unbelievable. So he comes with a record that for part of the population, somehow they can and they do forgive corruption and his attempt to capture judiciary and media, and they are somehow more tolerant toward that, toward his illiberal tendencies, because they know him and because they still believe that he somehow has their interests at heart. So it's not just the poor performance of the previous ones. There is also some kind of a recognition of the failure of the alternatives. There is a number of reasons, and what played a role in these elections as well.
I think that's right. It's not much of a comeback, really. I mean, he went from 18% in the last election to just under 23% in this election. And at the same time, some of his allies, people who would have formed coalitions with him, actually dropped significantly. So the parties of the radical right split, and then together polled just over half of what they polled, well, a little more than that, than what they polled in the previous election. And so, in those terms, the kind of net addition to Fico's, to say, if you add Fico, who has become a kind of, populism is a strange word, and it almost never applies in any given context. But people who are kind of anti-establishment, anti-incumbent, in this case, people who are really quite have become radically anti-West. That side of the political aisle, and then arguably anti-democratic in some ways. That side of the political spectrum didn't really gain any votes at all. They shifted around a little bit, and a few more went to Fico than in the past. But I think Erik's point that the shift occurred really within the other zone. The shift went from a bunch of parties that seemed chaotic and barely able to govern, that were built around movements and individual personalities. Those shifted to parties with some of the same values and beliefs, but with a more moderate tone of speaking, a little bit less individual-centric, and in many cases, parties that had long, deeper roots. So it is interesting that this parliament sees the return of two long-established parties in Slovakia's history that were established at the very beginning in 1989, which had been out of parliament for some time. Voters shifted back. Now, they didn't shift back a terrible amount. Those parties were always just below the threshold, but a significant percentage of Slovaks who were disgusted with the chaoticness of the otherwise fairly civic government shifted to some other alternatives.
Because one of the other interesting developments in the election was the rapid surge of Progressive Slovakia, right? Which is a more kind of socially liberal party that didn't get any seats back in 2020, but some polls were actually putting them in first place. And that eventually didn't happen, but they ended up second, right? So would you explain that by saying, well, what happened is that some of the voters that were supporting the other side decided to just switch to Progressive Slovakia, or what? How did that happen? How did their success happen?
Well, Progressive Slovakia, as it so happens, compared to the polls last week on Thursday, where they were on the par with Smer, looks a bit disappointing. Nevertheless, it's a very good news. The emergence of Progressive Slovakia is actually quite understandable, because we mustn't be blinded by the victory of Smer. There are other people, there are young people in Slovakia. This party reflects different values. And it's very good to see that the struggle between liberals, pro-European liberals, young people, human rights, environment, all these issues, that there is that struggle between Progressive Slovakia and what I would call kind of an old guard, because it's not just Smer, it's the SNS, it's Christian Democrats, who are coming from way back. So there is an ongoing struggle to maintain liberal democracy. So their emergence, to me, is a good news, but it's not even surprising they did have genuine support.
Mm-hmm. Because so when I hear experts talk about Slovakia, on the one hand, you hear people saying, well, in Slovakia, people tend to make parties very accountable and vote for parties that they think are going to produce good government. But on the other hand, there's also academics talking about this divide, which seems to be getting stronger and stronger between the kind of more conservative rural Slovakia and the liberal urban and younger Slovakia. Are both things at play here, or is that something that I'm missing in this picture?
I think Kevin is a bigger expert on this. No, your argument that basically there are two big camps in Slovak politics and they're just exchanging few voters there and there. But maybe to add to progressive Slovakia, I would say that there are several things that explained, I would say, slow rise, because really the party went slowly from 2020 till it reached its current result in these elections. They first managed to get rid of their coalition partner from 2020 and became much more sort of clear from ideological perspective and became a clear liberal party, pro-European, etc., etc. So that was one important thing just from the ability to explain what they stand for. I think the second thing has to do with this. Still, Zuzana Čaputová is a president. She is one Slovak politician that represents these values, was and still is, if not the most popular, one of the most popular politicians in Slovakia. So there is always somebody who represents this type of positions and values in Slovak politics and is visible. So that helps as well. And of course, this is a very sort of open party. I think the suggestions from exit polls, not yet sort of a lot of data from there, but just today, director of Focus, who did the exit poll, was suggesting that first-time voters voted strongly for progressive Slovakia. And also a lot of voters were explaining their choice for progressive Slovakia, not based on liberal ideology, but mostly about competent pro-Western government. So basically these things go hand in hand. And that result is sort of quite nice in isolation. It solves nothing for the sort of liberal part of the Slovak electorate, because other parties won more convincingly, and Smer is still the most important player when it comes to forming a new coalition. But what is important in Slovak politics, probably as everywhere else, is that party will receive a lot of money from state budget, and that contribution can help them to stabilize the party, stabilize basically all the stuff you need to run party properly. And that is, I think, a game changer if they are able to use those resources that will be provided to them to some building of the party, extending their network, extending their expertise, etc., etc.
I think one thing that is notable for maybe those who don't know Slovakia's party system more broadly is that Slovakia has a remarkably high rate of party system turnover, of change from season to season. Actually, this is fairly endemic across Eastern Europe and increasingly in Western Europe as well. I mean, I think it's a broader trend, but Slovakia really has been a leader on this. We often calculate the average age of political parties in Slovakia. The average age weighted by electoral results is 10 years old. Slovakia's party system has been 10 years old for more than 10 years. It gained about 1 year this year in average age because of the return of the Christian Democrats and the SNS, or the National Party, and Fico at a few more votes. But Slovakia really is divided now between three parties that constitute about 30% of the vote, which are fairly old, although even Fico Smer is only 20 years old. And then all of the rest of the parties are new or very new. And what you tend to see in Slovakia is a churn of the new and very new. Parties in the middle, parties rarely last for more than 10 or 15 years. And they often rarely last for more than 1 or 2 election cycles. And we saw that this time. I mean, the radical right was in for 2 election cycles and disappeared. A party called We Are Family, which never really had much of a profile, disappeared in this election. And it's been just very difficult for political parties in Slovakia to lay down the kinds of social roots that keeps them alive. The last one to really do it successfully is Fico, and there is a party called Freedom and Solidarity, which is moderately successful, but the party's never really managed to move much beyond 5%. That party itself is only 13 years old. So it is a system of consistent new parties. And Slovakia actually had the highest volatility in this election that it's had in 20 years. There's just been a lot of shifting back and forth among voters.
To add also to the specificity of this very proliferation of political parties in Slovakia is that many of them are splinter parties. Hlas is a splinter party of Smer. You know, they splinter so much. Republika, the far right, whose voters were slightly hoovered up by Smer, they are a splinter party from the LSNS. It is an endless proliferation, and in some ways I think that this demise of all these little parties, I mean, there was a party of a prime minister from some time ago suddenly also conceding elections with something like 1% or something. You know, it's an endless sort of a repetition of either splinters or people that come from the past. And I think that this time, the demise of these various small parties actually showed that it probably is not wise to just contest elections when you have minimal support. There is a lack of kind of a democratic compromise. So the gap between the first Free Party, with Hlas on 27, Smer on 42, PS on 32 seats in the middle, the gap between those and then the last four smaller ones that made it is huge. SAS, the Freedom and Solidarity, at 11 seats, Olano at 16. So there is a gap, and then it goes down to SNS and the Old Nationalist Party and Christian Democrats. So it showed, it kind of almost cleared this proliferation of parties of various negligible support, actually.
So when you read at least the Western media, one of the things that they seem to suggest about Fico's return is that Slovakia and the West might be drifting apart. Do you agree with this, or do you think that the election results are basically just reflecting long-standing divides and therefore nothing is going to change?
Maybe I would say that the West is drifting apart itself to a great extent. No, I would say one thing for sure, the Slovak history is connected to this idea that we stand somewhere between the West and the East. So this is something that has to do with our history, location, etc. The second thing I like to mention, although it's much more sort of about ideas than anything else, is that we are losing reference points in the United States, in Great Britain, these sort of reference democracies that we used to admire in the 90s. So it's much harder to find a good example how we should be governed, and also looking around in a region, looking north to Poland, looking to Hungary. So a much sort of more appealing reference points are arriving, and the people are looking around and they're saying, yeah, the United States is not working well, Great Britain as such. Look at the Hungary. I mean, Viktor Orban certainly knows what he is doing, and it seems that Hungarians are satisfied, at least from abroad, just without understanding anything about the Hungarian politics. So for sure, the election were also about this basically placement of Slovakia. But in the end, especially for Robert Fico and Smer, I mean, they're a very pragmatic party when it comes to especially EU, but also NATO as such. Already after the election, Mr. Fico stressed several times that this changes nothing about our membership, our commitment to both European Union and NATO. We will be critical, but we consider this to be existentially important for Slovakia. To translate this for anybody else, we need money from EU, so we will be good friends of European Union.
If you look at the overall vote in this election, the total number of people who voted for parties that might be considered in some form or another kind of intensely ethno-nationalist or anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-West, in fact, the share of people who voted for parties like that stayed the same or dropped. And so I think, Slovakia does have this part of its political side. Because of the shifting parties, it's sometimes hard to get, unless you really try to analyze it well, to get a sense of the overall flow of Slovakia's political vote in terms of ideological camps or families. But, the kind of nationalist camp in one form or another really didn't do any better, maybe arguably slightly worse in this election, whereas what you might call the civic right, the sides that are committed to the West and have a kind of recognizable ideology actually did somewhat better. The losers in this election in terms of numbers were really this kind of unprofiled, anti-corruption, really quite erratic parties that were in the center. The parties of the government went from 45% of the vote in the last election to 18% in this election. I mean, that was the four government parties. It's quite a shocking decline, even if you include splinters from one of those parties. And so, that really is where the shifting occurred, I think, in Slovakia. But it doesn't show a marked drift to Russia. It doesn't show a marked drift to authoritarianism. In some ways, quite the reverse. All that said, I think the next moment in Slovakia is really going to be defined by the decision of the splinter party that Erika mentioned, Hlas. And actually, I'm really interested in hearing what Erik and Erika have to say about that, because that party really, because it is both a splinter of Fico's party, but because it is also been more Western and in some ways a little bit more moderate, its leader speaks in very kind of moderate tones. It seems to be the critical party in coalition formation. And I'm really interested what my colleagues have to say about how that might pan out.
So this morning, it seems that Hlas is definitely the kingmaker in the formation of this new government, whatever it will be, because nobody can form a coalition without them. Now, it is a splinter party of Smer, and many members of Hlas would think that the natural ally for them is to be in coalition with Smer, and then either Slovak Nationalist Party or Christian Democrats. Christian Democrats say they're not considering it at the moment, and have always said that. That would give them fairly manageable majority, but not in any way convincing. Another option is, of course, that Hlas will not go with Fico, even though Fico was offering practically that he doesn't have to be a prime minister, and that he was suggesting that he would give this post as a winning party, forming coalition, would give the post of prime minister to Pellegrini. He, in fact, in his press conference said, I don't have to be automatically prime minister.
Pellegrini is the leader of Hlas.
Yeah. Now, the party is divided whether to go with Progressive Slovakia. Apparently, they are in contact in a sort of a not very clear, but the offers from Smer toward Hlas party coming, and Progressive Slovakia is also talking to them, because there is another option, which may be a little bit optimistic, but there is an option of Progressive Slovakia and Hlas with Freedom and Solidarity and with Christian Democrats. Nobody really is that keen on Olano. So the scene is suddenly quite open, and everything depends on this party, Hlas. Its membership is very divided on the issue, because they have an experience of being, its chairman, Pellegrini, has been prime minister with Smer, and the experience wasn't very good.
So it's not a given that Fico will end up being prime minister.
It is not a given, but at the moment, nothing is a given. But, I think have to wait. What Hlas is consulting the members and is consulting the regions.
And so if he does end up being a prime minister, would you say, I think Erik was suggesting that might be the case, that he might adopt a more kind of moderate discourse. So, for example, something that a lot of the media have been talking about is how he has been strongly against sanctions against Russia, also against giving further aid to Ukraine, etc. Do you think that he will end up kind of moderating his discourse on all of those issues, especially if he goes into government with Hlas?
Some of these positions, certainly no. He already repeated that the Ukraine, when it comes to military support, that will end in Slovakia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's clear. When it comes to Russia sanctions, I think that's where Mr. Fico can be much more sort of accommodating, and we'll wait for what the EU has to say about that. I think the sort of biggest, not fear per se, but what is possible in Slovakia is that basically from outside the country will look okay. So it will be not becoming a new Hungary or new Poland when it comes to the most excessive violations of rule of law and everything that is connected to governing. However, what I have to mention, because I think it's one huge part of Mr. Fico's comeback, is that the 2018 murders of investigative journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, and subsequent protests, and basically Fico losing the 2020 elections, are also about a lot of criminal investigations that are still ongoing, that are targeting either explicitly or implicitly the Fico and his close allies, some of them already in the new parliament. So this is what is in play. Mr. Fico used last 2 years in presenting all these criminal investigations as a political vendetta, basically using the same rhetoric Donald Trump is using in his various legal problems. So for sure, he needs to be in the government. He needs to have control over police, over attorney general, over maybe judicial council, to make sure that none of this sort of ongoing investigation will result in anything that will touch his people. And this is, I would say, to a small extent, also case for Mr. Pellegrini and some of his party members, top party members, because they were part of Smer for a long time. So this discussion about the sort of ideals and policies, everything, have to be also complemented by discussion about the most sort of basic fears that you have to have a power, otherwise there is a huge threat that you can end up in jail. And this still plays an important role. Mr. Fico is openly saying that he's going to change police, he's going to change people at the special prosecutor's office, etc., etc. So he makes no basically secrets about that this is important for him. Yet, because he was able to present this as a political vendetta, his voters are completely okay with this. They considered everything that was touching him from a criminal perspective as injustice.
So my last question, does this mean that we need to be concerned about Slovakian democracy then?
I think that we ought to be careful not to exaggerate the danger that Slovakia may pose, but particularly the Western press is worried about that Slovaks don't hate Russia and that Slovakia is a threat to European security. I think we must not exaggerate that. It's a very small country with little influence, a fairly fearful country that we probably should take into consideration. It's 30 years old. And so I think that is not a danger. Slovak democracy has been struggling for a long time, and sometimes they do well, and these elections were free, they were fair. They in some ways, despite a prime minister that engages with in criminal way of capturing judiciary and police, they do have a sense of what is at play. Yes, there are challenges. There are huge challenges for Slovak democracy, which maybe will not be resolved over the next 3-4 years if the government that will be formed will last the full cycle. It is probably even longer term. That's why some people suggest that it would be better for progressive Slovakia to remain in opposition so that they can gain more experience, because a lot of voters were concerned about their inexperience, and that then they can come back when the era of Fico is finally over. So yes, there are challenges, huge challenges. Whether we should now be concerned about Slovakia drifting away from the West, I am not so sure. This country's been invaded by the Warsaw Pact armies in '68. Nobody wants to see those tanks back. And I think that a little bit more kind of a constructive negotiations would be more helpful than this hiked up rhetoric of the fear of Slovakia with 5.5 million population.
I take very much to heart Erik's notion that the U.S. no longer offers a kind of as stable a democratic anchor as it used to. And in fact, I've been talking up Slovak civil society and democracy in the U.S. for the last several years, having had a chance to experience it. And I think I would echo what Erika has to say. The fundamentals seem quite sound. I mean, Slovakia has struggled, but it has built a strong democratic tradition. It's interesting that there were no major, as far as I can tell, suggestions that these elections were falsified in any way, even among people who have a vested interest in doing so. And that the underlying Slovak civil society, the organizations that have been built, the underlying reliance of Slovak voters on elections as the way of solving political questions. And I would say, paradoxically, the relative fragmentation of Slovakia's political parties that prevents any one party from dominating. I think they may contribute to a little bit of instability and kind of movement back and forth, but they certainly act as a kind of barrier to the worst case scenarios that we've seen to the south and to a lesser extent to the north in Slovakia. So I think the fundamentals at the moment are quite sound, and I think this election, by actually turning away from really quite erratic anti-corruption types to somewhat more moderate and measured and thoughtful politicians in the center, I think shows actually that you have a country where people are dissatisfied with a government. They don't fly to the radical opposition. They flew toward the center, and that to me is a positive sign. Maybe the most important thing that comes out of this election.
And more women in the parliament.
That's a positive note.
Significant increase of female MPs under any combination.
Yeah, I thank you both, Erika and Kevin, for optimistic spin of a future in Slovakia. I think that you are completely right that the fundamentals when it comes to civil society, but also media that is quite independent, still to a certain extent influential. The sort of my skepticism lies first with the role that Facebook is playing in Slovak politics, and how the sort of mainstream media is losing its appeal and influence. Robert Fico basically skipped the most important TV debate before elections on the most watched private network, Markíza, because he wasn't bothered, and he used the opportunity to criticize the network as being not objective, etc., etc. So there is a slight sort of fear from this, how you can basically increase polarization via using alternative information sources. And we are really having a terrible time to do any contra-information campaigns. Facebook is not investing any money, any resources to protect anything here, because it's a small market. So just to end up, the first 3 months in 2023, the top 10 political posts on Facebook in Slovakia with interactions reaching millions, so basically almost all country, were about the Russian trolls explaining Russian positions in Ukraine. So this is where we are basically slowly losing the huge amount of population, because we are not able basically to get any information to them. And this is what Mr. Fico and Smer are using quite well. Basically, Mr. Fico's return can be also explained by daily use of Facebook, live Facebook, and basically talking directly to his supporters, to his voters.
Okay, I like it very much that on the whole, despite all of those challenges, we end up on a positive and optimistic note. This was such a truly fascinating discussion. So thank you very much, Kevin, Erika, and Erik, for participating in the podcast. And I hope our listeners will find it as interesting as I certainly did.